Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I want to introduce you again to Leah Taylor-Roy. She is the federal Liberal Member of Parliament for Aurora, Oak Ridges, Richmond Hill. She has got one of the most impressive resumes of anyone that I've had the pleasure of interviewing from politics or elsewhere, and we'll probably review some of her experience in a couple of minutes. But she just came back from Africa, where she was attending a really interesting conference on women and equal rights, and some, issues, reproductive issues and others that women around the world face. Leah Taylor-Roy, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Brian. It's a pleasure to be back and talking to you again. It's a very interesting and important topic, actually.
So tell us about it. This wasn't a boondoggle. You're going to Africa.
It wasn't a boondoggle. And in fact, I have to say, Brian, I avoid boondoggles. I try not to travel especially when it's funded by other governments or other organizations where I at all feel indebted. And this one was through I'm a member of the Canadian Association of Parliamentarians for Population and Development. And that's a nonpartisan organization in our parliament across the Senate and the House of Commons and all parties of people who are interested in the topic of women's equality, and in particular, issues to do with population and development. So it was as a member of that committee that I attended this conference. And it was actually funded by the European Parliamentary Forum, which is a group that brings parliamentarians together. So we had meetings of groups of parliamentarians. There were over 60 of us who met from around the world, concurrent with this Women Deliver conference, which was really a very, very large meeting, 6,000 people, majority women by far, but men and other people, other gender diverse people who are interested in advancing the goals of equality for women for many reasons, not just because it's a human right and it's the right thing to do, but there are many, many reasons as countries and as a globe excuse me, that we should be concerned about this issue.
And tell us, where was this conference?
Oh, it was held in Kigali, Rwanda, which was a very interesting place to hold it for many reasons. One of which is that Rwanda boasts the highest number of women parliamentarians of any government in the world, at over 60%. And of course, Canada is less than half of that. Right now, and it has for many other reasons. As you know, there was
I didn't know that.
Massive genocide.
So our cabinet is 50%, but you're saying the number of parliamentarians is less than 30%?
It's just over 30% now, Brian. Just over 30.5 or something. Yes, but because the cabinet we can mandate, the cabinet, our government has decided, it's a feminist government. They've decided that they want to have parity in the cabinet, which is something that can be dictated by the government. However, members of parliament, as you know, are elected by the people, and there is no requirement for the number of men, women, and any other groups to be represented.
So in 2023, with progress that women have made, is there still a need for these kinds of organizations that are having these types of conferences that bring 6,000 people together to talk about women's rights?
Absolutely.
Why?
And I would say more now than ever, Brian. Partially because we haven't made the progress that we should make. I mean, if you look at Canada, right, women have had the vote for over 100 years, and we've just barely reached 30% women in parliament. We're over 50% of the population. We should have 50% representation. I mean, it just makes sense, right? So when you see systemic results like this, it goes back to systemic, racism or discrimination. There are no reason why women should not have representation in accordance with their numbers in the population. And yet we don't. So we have to ask, why is that? Why is it a case still? And, even when you look at women's equality right now, and reaching that, there was a UN report that came out recently that showed it was going to be 123 years. I don't know the exact number. If we continue at the rate we're going now, it will take that long for women to have equal representation, equal economic opportunities, equal health outcomes, equality in many senses of the word globally. And thirdly, I'd say there's actually a backlash right now happening, as you may have noticed, globally and even in Canada, against women and gender equality, And I think that this is part of the movement, the far right movement that's happening, where anything that's seen as too progressive, and it depends on who you're talking to, what qualifies as too progressive. But the idea that the woke kind of policies, and as I like to say, I'd rather be awake than asleep. So, and I think that's what's happening, where people are asleep and we're going to go backwards if we don't wake up.
You really think the Supreme Court in the United States just effectively found against the ability, not even the right for, but the ability to have affirmative action. And so what you're effectively saying is that we need something that's more like a quota or affirmative action than allowing 123 years to establish equality.
Well, I'd actually rather, Brian, that we address the root causes rather than putting a quota in. That would be my preference. That things were such in our society and our economy that and cultural norms and values, and not just in Canada but worldwide, that women would be represented equally. But we've seen over and over again in countries around the world that once quotas are put in, we do reach those numbers. And once that happens, there's no need for the quotas after, because
Leah,
it's self-perpetuating.
excuse me, but I'm surprised that you're saying this. You have been a partner at McKinsey. You've been a CEO of a major company. You've been elected a member of parliament. You've proven, and from an stand, an incredibly contentious race where in a riding that a lot of people thought the Conservatives would win forever. And so aren't you proof that really quality in the candidate, quality in the person counts?
Oh, of course it counts, Brian. But why do we believe that there aren't as many capable, qualified women as men in this world? I mean, if that were the case, if you look around, women, in many respects, when you look at educational backgrounds, when you look at qualifications, women have more qualifications. But why aren't they running? Why aren't they winning? And why are they often put in unwinnable seats? There's a lot of questions to be asked about it, Brian.
Do you think party structures are putting women in unwinnable seats? Is that so? You think there's gender bias in party structures?
Oh, definitely. That's part of it. There's a great podcast called No Second Chances that Kate Graham did, which talks a lot about this. But you can just look at the data, look at the numbers. And the fact is, we have 30% women in Parliament right now. The Liberal Party has about 36% women. The Conservatives, about 18%. Now, in the Liberal Party, we do have a policy that requires ridings, associations, when they're nominating candidates, to look for qualified women. It doesn't require that they put them there, but they have to make an effort to ask women to run, because often women don't come forward or think of it themselves. And there's many reasons for that, Brian. I mean, as we know, women still provide most of the care, at home, whether it's for elderly or children. And just look at what happened during COVID. And that reality is underscored. The number of women that left the workforce as opposed to men, because of the needs of taking care of children or elderly, because
it's also a pretty demanding job. I know from personal experience, it's a pretty demanding job that has some pretty dramatic impacts on relationships and families. And so some people don't care about the impact that it has on relationships and families, and other people might. And, I think that a lot of people self-select.
Absolutely. But why should that be the requirement? Why should we have that as a requirement for capable, intelligent people?
Well, one of the reasons is just this need to be in Ottawa every week. And I know that, one of the big controversies that happened is whether you can stay hybrid. And, I think that the Liberal government suggested that a hybrid parliament could continue. And there's been a lot of voices that say no, that, we never dreamt of debate, question period, and other things occurring via Zoom.
Well, in fact, it passed. We do have a hybrid parliament now. It will continue. And again, I think that it is a good thing to do for people who have families, not just women, men. I mean, we have members whose partner may experience a stroke, and you need to be there. Well, in the past, without hybrid parliament, your constituency would lose their representation because you had no way or right to vote if you were not physically in the House. Now, if you're a man whose wife has just had a stroke, what are you going to do? you have to choose between fulfilling your requirements as a parliamentarian, as a representative, or leaving your spouse in a critical condition. As you know, my husband had a very, very serious heart attack last summer. Like, it was the summer, so I didn't have to face that challenge, but it would be difficult. And why are we required to make those choices when there is technology and there are ways that we can continue to do our jobs and still be compassionate human beings and family members?
Interesting conversation we're having today with Member of Parliament Leah Taylor-Roy. We're going to take a break and come back with her in just 2 minutes. We're going to talk about some of the other issues that came up at this conference in Rwanda. I think that one of the topics we got to turn to is abortion and women's rights, reproductive rights in that regard. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I've got one of the most impressive members of Parliament I've had the pleasure of interviewing on with us today. She is Leah Taylor-Roy. She's the Member of Parliament for Richmond Hill, Aurora, Oak Ridges, and Richmond Hill, north of Toronto. And I've got to tell you a little bit about her background just before we go on, if we could. She's graduated with Bachelor of Commerce from the University of Toronto, Trinity College. She's got a master's of is it public policy from the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University in Boston, or in Cambridge, Massachusetts. She then joined McKinsey, one of the world's largest, most successful management consulting companies, and she was there for 6 years. She then became the executive vice president of the International Energy Corporation. She was a teacher and mentor at the Option Institute and Autism Treatment Center of America. She was the federal Liberal candidate in Aurora, Oak Ridges, and now she is the Member of Parliament. She comes from a political background. Your mayor, your father was mayor, I understand, yes. Of Aurora?
Newmarket.
Newmarket, I apologize.
Just north of my riding, yep.
And you've lived outside of the country, and you've lived in Newmarket and Aurora. You've got an incredible amount of volunteer experiences. You were a cabinet member of Greenwood College School, a board member of the Option Institute and Autism Treatment, a volunteer for Habitat for Humanity, a founding member for Extra Specialties. I wonder what that is. A singer for Voices of Joy in Newmarket, a co-founder of Our World Children's Museum, a mentor in place at Rosie's Place for Civil Rights and Social Action, and a founder and chair of Gems of Hope USA. Leah, I just got to ask you, with this kind of a background, an incredible amount of volunteer charitable activities, and an incredibly illustrious career with McKinsey and other entities like the International Energy Corporation, why do you want to become a member of Parliament?
Well, Brian, I think that for me, contributing to the future, not only of Canada, but of our world is incredibly important. But, Canada's a fantastic country. It's a great country. And I am so lucky to have been born here, to grow up here, to live here for most of my life. That, when I had done all of these things, and quite frankly, we were talking about women and our ability to become Member of Parliament. When my youngest child turned 18, I decided that I was at a point where I really looked at what I wanted to do and what I wanted to contribute, kind of the third act, as many people call it. And I really felt that it was time for me to try and use some of my lived experience, some of my experience in my education, to make Canada better. As the leader of the Liberal Party always says, better is always possible. And I was living in the United States for a while, as you've alluded to. And when Donald Trump won there, I was frightened. I saw what happened in communities and in politics in the United States, and continues to happen. And I was worried about Canada. I thought if it could happen in the United States, it could happen here. And I felt very strongly that I wanted to wanted to participate and do what I could to help the Liberal Party stay in power, because in my mind, it was the best party to represent Canadian values and to represent the center of Canada.
So how does flying to Rwanda and participating in a conference for women's rights assist you in that role?
Well, my first, and as I told you before, I don't do much of this. This is actually, I was asked by this parliamentary association to do it. And initially, lined up someone else to go because my first priority is my riding and representing my constituents. I've always said that. However, as a parliamentarian, you do play other roles and you do have other responsibilities. And when I am part of an organization, I take that seriously. And as I'm on the executive of this parliamentary association spoke to you about, I felt it was very important for us to be represented in the parliamentarian forum at this Women Deliver conference. And issues of international assistance and international concern are of concern to Canadians, and they are also affect Canadians deeply. I mean, we can look at the recent what we call the poly crisis. If you look at climate change, conflict, the fallout from COVID-19, those are all global issues. Those are all things that have happened in our world, and our borders do not protect us or somehow say that just because it's not happening in our borders, we shouldn't be concerned, because the things that happen around the world have a direct impact on us as Canadians. And not just from that practical matter, I also think as Canadians, we have a role to play in the world in terms of trying to solve some of these global problems and crises. So it's, in my mind, it's the right thing to do, and it's the smart thing to do for Canadians.
So let me challenge you on that if I could. On climate change or something like that, I can completely understand and agree with you. But women's rights and reproductive rights. Let's focus on reproductive rights for a second. Why would that be an international issue? It's going to be decided by different Supreme Courts, and I think our courts and the U.S. courts and our Parliament and the U.S. Congress, et cetera, have made different decisions, and different political jurisdictions have the right to make those decisions. And you talk about Canada's responsibility to have an impact. Well, we've just had this huge complaint about China's desire to have an impact and a negative impact on our elections. Why do we think that we have a right to have an influence on the responsibility local parliaments have to make judgments on what they think about women's rights and reproductive rights?
Well, I don't think it's for us to say, Brian, but certainly there are many, many organizations and many women around the world who are fighting for the rights of women. We're not coming in and telling people this is what you need to do. This is the great white missionary kind of approach. We're working with and trying to support organizations that are working for women's equality and women's rights. And when you talk about sexual and reproductive health and rights, we're not just talking about abortion. We're also talking about family planning. We're talking about, child brides. We're talking about a number of things which affect the economic and social progress of these countries as well. And again, what I said before in terms of it being the right thing to do and the smart thing to do, we are as a country helping these countries to meet their goals. And so it's not us coming and saying do this. It's us supporting work that is being done. And quite frankly, for me, being there, it's listening to what's happening in other parts of the world. It's listening to lessons learned, because our experience in Canada is very different. But we still have a lot of work to do too.
So tell me what happened in regards to reproductive rights. I would have thought that, and I'm not obviously aware of what's happening elsewhere in the world, but certainly the Supreme Court decision in the United States on Roe v. Wade is seen as a sort of a bellwether negative for women's reproductive rights, is it not? And how's that impacted global attitudes?
Well, I think it is, and it's part of the backlash I referenced earlier. So I think people are aware that there are forces at work that would like to see women's rights actually lessened in some ways. They're certainly not increased. I think those are at work. And there's other cultural and religious norms too, Brian. This is not just, a backlash against women. And we have to understand what those are and work with them. But I think that, at the Women Deliver conference, there's an acknowledgement that this is happening. And this is where it's important to meet and talk about how do we work with people? How do we communicate? How do we get the message out that this is not just about abortion? This is not just about, saying someone's right or wrong. It's about how do we work together to really help meet those fundamental goals that we're all trying to meet in terms of, social and economic development, education, participation in the workforce, the eradication of poverty. All of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, they're linked to this. When you look at the impact that women having the choice of when and how to have children, the impact it has on economies, the impact it has on education, the impact it has on health, on representation, it's enormous. So this is part of the problem. We need to work with people and to sit down and say, okay, you have these concerns, you have these beliefs, but let's talk about other impacts of these policies. So let's talk about, for example, with religious groups. When people look at someone like myself advocating for women's rights, for family planning, they can say, well, you don't care about families. What about family values? Well, I turn that on its head, Brian. We care about families. We care about family values. That's why we want families to have the choice as to when to have children and how many to have. Because if a child is unwanted, it's bad for the child. It's bad for the parents. It's bad for the community and the country. The stories I heard in Rwanda, because of course, this is where there was the huge genocide in 1994, stories about women who were raped during that genocide, many of whom were infected by HIV and AIDS. The stories of children that were born because there were no choice in that situation, abortion was not available, and that were unwanted, that suffered. But even you can say, okay, it was wrong for them not to be wanted, but the societal structure where I met a woman at one of the collectives I went to talk to, she was raped as a young woman. The same person who raped her murdered most of her family. The remaining family members wanted nothing to do with her or that child because of the memories and the implications of where that child came from and who the father was. The woman suffers.
But the child had nothing to do with that. Why should
Absolutely.
the child have to take
and
on
neither
that
did the
responsibility?
Woman, I couldn't agree with you more. But it's what happens, Brian. And, in some cultural norms, there are so many orphans. There are so many women who are traumatized and just the intergenerational trauma from this that goes on. This is an extreme example. But what I'm saying is we have to look at, are we really caring? Are we really trying to help people and raise, families where children are healthy and happy when we're talking about limiting family planning, when we're talking about limiting access to reproductive rights? I don't think so. I don't think those are caring policies.
Okay, so I'm a firm believer in a woman's right to choose. And so let me state that to start with. But, here you are in some international conference. What is it you're trying to accomplish? Are you trying to educate, to force, to pass global laws in regards to women's rights to choose, abortion, et cetera? Like, what is it that you're actually trying to do?
The focus of the conference was not on abortion, Brian. That was not the focus. I have to say that up front. It's on women's equality and on, as I say, sexual and reproductive health rights, which has a lot more. We talked a lot more about family planning, ending childhood marriages, about women in the care economy and how women could get education. So it was a very broad thing. And we weren't telling people what to do. I don't believe that's my role or our role. We were sharing experiences. We were sharing things that we've seen done. We were encouraging and supporting groups of women who perhaps don't have the same privilege and the same access to things that we do. For example, the International Development Research Corporation, which is a Crown Corporation, was there. It's a Canadian Crown Corporation that does research in developing countries. So we're there to support and help and look at ways that we can collaborate and encourage. There were young women there from one I met from the Sudan, very interested in this area. And we have such privilege and we have such experience here, but so do these countries. So it's about an exchange of information. It's about collaboration and solidarity and trying to energize and support this really important work that's being done. And it's important on so many fronts. It's not just about women or about abortion, although those things are important, don't get me wrong. Sexual and reproductive health and rights are important, but it's all that enables women to do. And it's all the ways that we need every intelligent, capable, person on this earth, woman or man, to have the opportunity to do what they can to help us solve the issues we're facing. And so we can't afford for women not to have the education, not to have the opportunities, not to be able to do what I have been privileged and able to do anywhere in the world, quite frankly. And we are right now missing out on that a great deal because of the lack of equality for women.
We're chatting tonight with Member of Parliament from Aurora, Oak Ridge's Richmond Hill, Leah Taylor-Roy. We're talking about a conference that she attended in Rwanda, interesting enough, on women's rights and equality. We're going to take a break for some messages and be back with her in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Leah Taylor-Roy. She's the Member of Parliament for Aurora, Oak Ridge's Richmond Hill, which is north of Toronto. Her father was the mayor of Newmarket, which is in the area. She has an incredibly illustrious career with McKinsey and energy companies as a volunteer in the charitable sector, and she was a candidate for MP, and then she's become elected as the Member of Parliament. And it's fantastic to have someone of her caliber in our national parliament. Leah, I want to ask you about what the benefit of this and how Canada can actually influence what's going on internationally. You know, I think what a lot of people think about, what I remember is when we tried to during the Harper government direct our monies only to organizations that had policies either pro or anti-abortion that were consistent with whatever the government thought. There's this recent controversy in the United States with their defense bill in regards to trying to influence international reproductive rights issues as part of a defense bill, which sounded kind of strange. So what is it that you think Canada, not you just individually as a representative of Canada at this conference, but Canada as a country can do to either support issues or, if decided, not support issues?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, Brian, that, every country, the government of every country, their policies are going to reflect their values, obviously. And as liberals, the right, the dignity and the rights of every human being is fundamental. So that means every human being. And so obviously women's rights are very important. And, in the last Women Deliver conference that was held in 2019 in Vancouver, our Prime Minister made a commitment to really focus our international assistance on programs that help achieve women's equality. And again, I think this is it's a very good thing to do. And I think also it is an economically smart thing to do, because when you look at it from an economic perspective, the marginal returns of dollars spent for women and helping to elevate women and engage women in the workforce are great. Women, one of the when you mentioned my not-for-profit work, one of the things I did for 10 years is I was co-founder and executive of the Gems of Hope USA. That was a microcredit organization, and we went to many areas. It was mostly South America, Central America, but helping set up microcredit, working with microcredit organizations and funding women to start small businesses. Now, it wasn't only women, it was open to anyone, but 90% of the people who came and wanted to be engaged were women. They were the ones who would do so much and give so much back to their families because they wanted to pay for their children's bus fare to go to school. They wanted to make sure that they had the health care, and they wanted family planning, Brian. They wanted to control their fates. They knew that too many children were too big a burden. But when you invest in women, you invest in families and communities. And we see, even with programs like the one we just put in place in Canada, our national early learning and childcare program that was implemented with agreements with every province and territory, that is now across our country. The productivity and economic gains that we are going to realize as a country from this, some could say pro-women, I would say it's pro-family policy, are significant. And we know that because we have the model of Quebec, where they've had a program like this in place for decades. And we've seen the increase in women's participation in the labor force. And we've seen what that translates into in terms of economic growth for our country and revenue. And so it's forecast by several different, independent private sector organizations that this investment, social investment, or I would say investment in social infrastructure, will actually yield returns of 150%. So we're investing, but we're going to get back. And this is what it's like globally. When you invest in women, we help with our international assistance to elevate countries and societies as well, because the marginal returns are more from investing in women in many of these things, partially because they're so much further down, Brian. They have so much more room to rise and to contribute. So it's a smart thing to do. And so we have an international feminist international assistance policy, but it doesn't mean that we don't fund. This is very broad and in scope, and it's not just. Let me be very clear. It's not just about reproductive rights. It's about education. It's about health. It's focused on many things. But there are so many governments, and there are so many, both domestic governments and governments providing international aid, that don't recognize this at all, that we need countries to start to focus on this, because I think we're going to see much greater impact and much greater progress if we put more money, or at least 50% of the money, into women and girls.
You said earlier that you thought there was a backlash to these kinds of activities. What's the backlash and why?
I'm not sure why, Brian, but I do think when times are difficult, when people are frightened, when change is happening, people want to either, do one of two things: either want to go back to the good old days, or they want to find a group to blame. And I think we're seeing this in different ways in different areas, where either groups are being targeted. In Canada, there's some people who are targeting immigrants. In other countries, there are people who are targeting women and saying we need to go back to, the old days, the values, the good old days, which I don't think ever really existed, the good old days. And if it did, it might have been for one group of people, not for all people. But it's, I think we need to move forward through understanding what is causing this backlash, and to working with people who are, concerned, frightened, anxious, whatever it is, about the change that's coming. And the change that is coming is not change that any of the groups that are being targeted is producing. The change is global. Things like COVID, things like conflict, things like the climate crisis. These things are happening globally, and there's a lot of political and economic uncertainty. And I think we have to realize that as a country, we're always going to be stronger united. To divide our country, to have people pitted against each other, to have people blaming each other, it's not the way we're going to move forward.
So this, and I'm going to not obviously go into the legalistic of it, but this recent U.S. Supreme Court finding against affirmative action, effectively, I think, said that affirmative action is discrimination against the people that aren't part of what's being, helped by affirmative action. And so, affirmative action for females was discrimination against males. Affirmative action for blacks was discrimination against whites, is effectively what they found. Do you agree with that or disagree with that?
I wouldn't say it's discrimination per se. Does it, because of when you think of discrimination, at least the common usage of the word, you think of something that's being done to hurt another group in some way. Maybe that's how they see it, that it's hurting the group. But I look at it, Brian, and you referenced what I've done as a woman, and isn't that an example that women can do these things? Perhaps, but I feel like I've been privileged in a lot of ways, not economically. I didn't grow up with a silver spoon in my mouth or anything like that, but just living in Canada, and I've had opportunities that I've been able to take advantage of for many reasons, but not everybody gets those opportunities. And when you look at groups of people, we can talk about Indigenous people in Canada who were discriminated against clearly for decades and decades. And you look at where those groups are today, and if you say there should be no kind of reparation or no kind of help given to these groups to make up for the harm and the setbacks that occurred for decades and decades of mistreatment and discrimination and hatred, then I think we're wrong. We have to find a way to be able to right the wrongs, to ensure that people have equal choices, even when discrimination in the past has happened. And so I'm not sure how exactly that can be done, Brian. Now, I still am a believer in quotas of sorts, but it's a very, very nuanced area. But I am not willing to say that today we do not have to try and make up for, discrimination and harm that was caused to groups that have, in fact, led to their being underrepresented or marginalized in some way today. And we have to figure that one out. And I think we can figure it out better working together than yelling across at one another.
We've had this big controversy in the last while in Canada about Chinese interference in our elections. And some people have raised the issue of, well, the United States has had influence funding the trucker convoy and funding different issues on an ongoing basis. Do we have a right to try to influence politics elsewhere around the world? Or is that really that we're talking out of both sides of our mouth, that people shouldn't have the right to do it here, but we should have the right to do it elsewhere?
Well, I think there's a fundamental difference between election interference and working with partners and other governments and organizations to meet agreed upon goals. It's a very, very different thing, Brian. And I think on the issue of election interference, having campaigns that are specifically targeted to interfere with democratic processes, that is something we need to stop. And it is global. It's everywhere, and it's happened forever. It's just getting more sophisticated and more pervasive. And as you said, it's all over. It's the U.S., it's China, it's India, it's many, many countries around the world. The list could go on. And countries will always, we're a global economy, we're a global entity. We're always going to be in the UN when we meet and we influence and we try and work together and kind of, do that. But there's a line that can't be crossed, Brian. And I think that's what's important to note. Okay, and I don't think we're doing that.
Okay, so let me ask you on one issue. You talked about teenage brides. And you talked about cultures. So if a country has a culture that teenage brides are okay, and frankly, a religion and a culture that promotes teenage brides, do we have a right? Should we be trying to influence that country, that culture, that religion to change their mind? It's something that we think is different here. Do we have a right to try to influence someone to change their culture, their religion there?
Well, again, I think it's about the approach, Brian. When you talk about a culture which thinks that teenage brides are the way to go, it's the thing to do, and selling young girls is a good thing. We also know that there are many, many women and young girls in that country that don't want that, and we know that we are working with partners and with other organizations, and we need to be working with these cultural groups to explain not only to explain the economic and social benefits of not doing this, of waiting until a child is 18 before they're married off, and having a conversation about how do we respect the cultural values, but how do we also respect the rights of these girls and women? And I think we do have a responsibility. And as I said, as I started, liberal values are about the dignity and respect of all people. And it's always balancing that. It can't be us against them. It has to be us coming together to figure out how do we move forward. And so one of the groups, it was called FP 2030, that I met with in Kigali, is in fact hosting a conference for religious leaders, cultural leaders, to talk about some of these issues and to really educate and explain. Because a lot of times that when you have a very strong belief in some respect, you haven't examined all of the repercussions or all of the other issues around it. And so it's a sharing of knowledge. And from my side too, listening to some of these people explain why they do the things they do and how it benefits them. But we have to work together and move forward, because there are so many things confronting our world right now that helping countries to develop, helping countries to get ahead and um, economically, socially, and be able to confront some of these crises, like the climate crisis, quite frankly, like other ones, hunger, extreme hunger. There's so many things that this plays into, Brian. And so I think it's about collaboration, not telling people what to do, but working with them.
I agree with you. I think that election interference is different, and interfering with a democratic process is different. But I think we do have a responsibility to, as humans, to voice our points of view, and to try to persuade people internationally and domestically in what we believe is right. But not force them, and not do it in a way that we are somehow in a non explicit, knowledgeable, public way trying to influence elections. So I do think there's a big difference between election interference and public policy promotion. Anyway, Leah Taylor Roy, Member of Parliament. You know what? I'm glad smart people, capable people, wonderful people like you go to these international conferences and represent Canada. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Brian. Pleasure as always.
We're going to take a break and come back with some of my own concluding comments in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everyone. Thanks, Leah.
Thank you.